What would change if creatives owned the strategy conversation? Would client relationships last longer? Would you be able to ask for more money? Ultimately, you're working with the same client and you're like, hey, every 6 months, they're like, hey, the market's changing. I need to raise my rates, but I love working with you. Hope this is okay. And they're like, absolutely, yes. I've been talking to a lot of creatives lately just about getting work. And there's, with AI, with just a competitive freelancer market out there, a lot of people are pointing to strategy. A lot of people are thinking that strategy is going to make a difference. In fact, throughout marketing, people want strategy and they don't seem to understand it. A lot of the people who hire you don't understand strategy. The marketing people, they don't understand strategy. How many times have you been told, oh, you don't get it, or you missed the mark and you never really understood why? Because, and they're just like, yeah, they just never called you again. The question is, how do we get better clients and make more money? If we think strategy is the problem, I think I have an answer, but I want to know what you guys think. And so the question today is, how can creatives use strategy to build better client relationships, better work, paid more stable income, more stable freelance income? So have you ever noticed how creatives and clients seem to talk past each other? The clients think you missed the mark. They can't completely explain why. They just feel it, right? Now, I'll tell you honestly, the C-suite is hearing the same thing you're hearing. You're the creative, right? You're the bottom of you're the contractor who's not even full-time. Then you have a marketing team in the middle, and then you have the C-suite. Now, the C-suite doesn't understand the marketing plan either a lot of times. And so you're not alone. It's just you're going to get blamed because you're the one who's getting hired. And they're just going to try to keep going through people until they find somebody. And they may never find somebody because their strategy is wrong. Here's what you can do to help. And in helping, you're going to set yourself up in a much better position. Instead of not knowing what they want, you're going to be able to help them understand what they want. But first, we have to understand why this happens so much. Where do most creative problems actually start? And so when a client rejects the work, you think the problem is usually the designer writing itself, right? Or is it more often the problem wasn't defined in the first place? Those are kind of the two options, right? That I ran into a lot as a copywriter way back when I started. But the question is, before starting a project, how clear are you about the problem you're solving, who the audience is, and why the audience should want to do something different now, right? Why the audience should want to take you up on your call to action, let's say, respond to your ad. So if these things aren't clear, then what are you designing for? What are you writing for? And so what's the role? Well, then what's the role of the creative brief? There were times where it was really successful, but then there were times when there were several rounds of revisions on my writing. And I'm like, I don't really know what we're asking for here. And then I'd ask for help, and they would say, well, if you have any questions, ask me, right? Seriously, Chris, if you have any questions, you need to ask me. And I'd be like, okay, who's the audience? And then they'd just be vague about things. And so do you treat the creative brief like paperwork? Do you even get a creative brief? That's another question. Do you see the creative brief as the center of your project? Because I've had times where I've misunderstood and I knew the client wasn't being clear with me. And so I wrote my own creative brief so that I could say, here are my assumptions. Here's what I heard you say. And so they would know that if my creative was off the mark, if they could just change the information they gave me, maybe it would be on the mark, right? It would expose the fact that was the problem. But if you don't get a creative brief and you don't have a process, and you don't know how to do that, you don't even know how to write a creative brief, well, then how do you do that? And so the creative brief helps you explain your decision. It makes the work easier to defend. And it gives your client confidence that you're solving the right problem. And so what happens when the brief is weak? I mean, think about the last frustrating project you worked on. There was probably a really unclear brief. Did everyone agree on the goal? Probably not. Did the client know what success looked like? Probably not. Are they like, you ask them what success looks like and they're like, sales, it's like, well, can you explain to me how this is supposed to lead to sales, right? Like, share with me your strategy. Or did it just kind of drift, right? Did the project drift into, can we try something different? Can we see another version? This just isn't quite right. And they're not able to tell you why it's not quite right. How much of that comes from unclear strategy rather than the creative work? And so, all right, so now let's talk about how to change that relationship. What happens when creatives lead with strategy instead of just execution? Now, a lot of you are out there and you're like, I'm great at execution. I've been at certain places and certain environments where I killed it. I know one creative that I talk to regularly, and he was at a company called Local Motors, and he's such a smart creative. But the thing is, he had a really good creative director at Local Motors, and the creative director and I worked together a lot, and we were able to frame things up really well for this creative I'm talking about. And now he's telling me I can't find good work, I can't find good clients, nobody wants to pay. If they undervalue my work, they want me to do stuff for free on spec or whatever. And I'm like, dude, at this point in your career, you need to be way farther along than that. And so now I want to know like the strategy, the problem. And so what happens when creatives lead with strategy instead of execution? And so I think that what happens is clients start asking better questions. So if you're leading and they're saying, here's what we want to do. And you're like, okay, it sounds like you, instead of saying, well, what do you want me to do? Instead of being a lump and just being like, well, you tell me what you want, right? You're actively saying, oh, it sounds like you're trying to do this, and you rephrase it. And they're like, yeah, pretty soon, if you can connect with them on that, if they can be vulnerable a little bit with you on that and just like talk through with you, and you're like, that's a smart idea or whatever, you're giving them, you're handing the ball back and forth, you're really getting along, you're vibing. And then pretty soon now you're like, okay, cool. So it sounds like this is what we're really selling is this. This is the call to action. This is why they should say yes, right? This is who they are. And now that we know that, the creative brief is what is it, who's it for, and why does it matter to them? That's the creative brief. And so now you have this process, right? And so now instead of saying like, oh, I don't like this, you're turning your creative, you think it's great. You're thinking like, man, I'm close, or this is it, man. And they're like, oh yeah, well, it's a little bit off. Can you start over? And you're like, no, starting over is not in scope. You need to tell me what you want to change, And they're just like, yeah, I don't like this one, And so, but you get that feedback and they say, I don't like this. And you're like, okay, so does it solve the problem we defined that we defined earlier? You could even send them an email with a little brief in it, right? And then they can say, well, actually that wasn't the problem. And you can say, oh, okay. So the problem changed. You're kind of setting it up to where you're like, hey, it's not my fault. It sounds like it's something you need to figure out, but I'm here for you, right? Now you may decide you don't want to do that. You may just decide you guys don't have it together enough. This is going to be a lot of work and I'm out. But if you decide you want to be a partner, what you're doing is you're clarifying what's your responsibility and what's my responsibility. And this part is your responsibility. And so say, hey, what I heard from you before was this. And I think we talked about that, but it sounds like you need to move this way. Tell me about that more. Tell me why you think that's off base. Now they feel like you're a partner. You're not throwing them under the bus. You're not like emailing the whole team. You're like getting on a call with them, hopefully, and just like, hey, let me be your partner. Now, do you think that person's going to work with you again? Do you think they're going to feel like a kinship? Like, hey, I care about your success. And now they're going to want to defend you a little bit. Man, could that be a really valuable relationship to them? And could it be something that they now see as something that a partnership that they want to preserve and they need, that's going to make them, help them do better in their job? Can strategy make creatives more valuable? A good strategic process. To think about that, let's think about the difference between two creatives. So let's say we have one creative and they're always waiting for instructions. They make options. They're not asking more questions. They're not trying to understand the strategy or where the strategy might be off. They just know they're frustrated. They just know that if I give them more options, hopefully they'll find something they like, but they're not really trying to problem solve. Now think about creative B. Creative B is helping to find the problem in the first place. You're the one who's like, is this what you're trying to do? And they're like, yeah. Or they're like, no, not exactly. It's this. And you're like, oh, okay. And you're showing that you understand what makes them successful. You're clarifying the audience, and then you're anchoring all the work and the strategy in the brief in what you guys agreed on. You're saying, okay, well, there's a brief that's out here that we can both look at and send them an email or whatever, or like put it on a page or whatever and say, here's what I think you're saying. And I think let's make this concise and so we can test, right? So when I give you the next round that you can, and you may ask him for more scope, because you had to redo it based on new information or whatever, but you're able to say like, this is your responsibility, this is my responsibility, but I'm happy to help, right? So you're able to show a massive amount of professionalism. You're not getting blamed as much. You're giving it yourself the best chance at good work, and then you're preserving that client relationship. So which one do you think is more valuable? Now, the reason I'm asking some of these things is because there is a pretty simple strategy process that I taught at the University of Oregon, where I taught the capstone class in the advertising program. And the capstone class was very simple. It was aligning strategy with what we're selling, who's it for, and why does it matter to the audience, and then where do we find them, the media plan. I think, and this is my theory, is that a little bit of instruction on that could go a long way for creatives who want to raise their stock in the minds of clients. And so I'm toying with the idea of standing up something like that for creatives. And I want to know if that's going to be something valuable to you. And I hope if it is, or if any of this resonates with you, you'll let me know, because I really want to know if this is something that's going to be valuable or not. But what does curiosity have to do with strategy? Now, not all of you are going to be curious. Not all of you are going to be able to bring a strategic, high-level strategic mind to this. But when a client explains a project, do you mostly just start thinking about solutions, or do you start trying to understand the problem? Problem-mindedness is one of the more strategic things you can do, to try to say, here's the problem. Okay, now I'm going to start thinking about solutions, but it's only after you start to understand the problem. So questions like, what's really driving this project? What problem are we trying to solve? And then what would success look like? What do we want to see happen? Good creative work starts with better questions. And so I want to ask you this last thing. What would change if creatives owned the strategy conversation, even if the client doesn't? Imagine you're routinely asking, who is this really for? Why does this matter to them? What do you want them to think, feel, or do? Would projects become clearer? Would they go faster? Would they be easier to defend? Would client relationships last longer? Would you become more of a right-hand person to the strategist? Would you be able to ask for more money? Ultimately, would you be able to raise your rates over time, right? You're working with the same client and you're like, hey, every year or so, or 6 months or whatever, you're like, hey, the market's changing. I need to raise my rates, but I love working with you. Hope this is okay. And they're like, absolutely yes. If you're a good renter, and if you've ever rented from someone who owns their own property and manages it rather than a management company, like I was paying my rent on time, and I take care of the place, and I let them know if there's a problem early, right? Because obviously, but when I rent from management companies, they treat me like garbage. They just treat me like anyone else, right? They're glad that I pay on time, but ultimately they're the boss, and they can be jerks, right? They can be power trippy, kind of like an HOA a little bit, right? But when I've rented from people who owned their own property and managed it, they didn't want me to leave. They didn't raise rent like other people did. We had a lot of respect. I had respect for them. They had respect for me. I would tell them whenever there was a problem, I would offer, hey, let me see if I can fix it, or at least fix it for the short term. I'm not like, toilet's broken, need you to get down here right away. I never did that. I was like, hey, here's what's going on. Help me out. Here's what I can do to help you out. Do you want me to run down to the store or whatever? And I had great relationships with those people. Now I'm like, why am I paying for a house when I have to pay for all the repairs and everything, when I could just, rent from somebody who owns the place? But that's the same thing. You're working with people. They start to depend on you. They start to really like you. You're not a headache. You're a huge advantage. They don't have to think about that rental all the time. All they have to do is call you. Hey, how's everything looking? Whatever. And they can trust you. Man, that's worth so much. Your rent doesn't go up. In your case, you're able to charge more. Your work is better. You have more job security, because a lot of us are really looking for like, hey, how do you spend more time with your family? How do you pay for trips? But how do you also schedule trips and make sure you're not going to be burdened with work? How do you make sure that you're not someone who has to respond every single time someone asks you for a job or asks you for work? And I think this is the way to do it, is you want to set things up. You want to be purposeful. And I think that being strategic and having those really good, respectful relationships with clients is really going to help. I really want to know if you think there's opportunity here. I really want to know, because I will spin up something like this. I love creatives. I've been a creative. I understand the pain. and so I'd love to stand something up if it would help you guys, but I need to know, and I need to make sure it's worthwhile. So hope this has been helpful. I'd love to hear your comments, and I'd love to see if there's something you guys need.